privilege tonight to obviously have two leading, provocative and, dare I say, iconic people from the queer community, Dennis Altman and Masha Gessen. First starting with Masha. She comes to us from New York, but is an acclaimed Russian-American journalist and author of many bestsellers, which I think some are available out the back there from Roland from Hares and Hyenas. She's been described as Russia's leading LGBT activist and has said herself that for many years she was probably the only publicly gay person in the whole country. Masha was forced to leave Moscow when it became unsafe for her family and writes from New York. Dennis, in fact, I met Masha at Dennis's book launch recently this year, so there's a connection here between the three of us. Dennis first came to attention, as many of you know, with the publication of his book Homosexual, Oppression and Liberation in 1972, a seminal text of the gay liberation movement. He's currently a professor of politics and a director of the Institute for Human Security at La Trobe University. And his most recent book, which I do have a copy of because I was at the launch, Queer Wars, explores the growing international polarization over sexual rights and also explores ways that polarization and the politics of sexual minorities can actually influence our efforts to advance those rights. And that's, I guess, where my relevance comes in. I work advocating for LGBTI equality and rights as a human rights lawyer and also an advocate. So I guess I'm at the coalface of this day to day, but I don't often get to sit back and speak to people who think and reflect really deeply on these issues. So it's a real privilege for me to be here with both of you tonight. So starting, perhaps we'll try and stay off Trump for the very beginning, but we will get there. I know you're all waiting to hear about their thoughts on Trump, but starting with perhaps the current situation in Russia, Masha, and it was 2013 where we saw the introduction of those anti-gay propaganda laws. Actually the same year that in Australia we had our first ever federal protections against discrimination introduced. So the signs of regression in one part of the world obviously don't prevent signs of progression in others. But I'd be really interested in your take on the political and social conditions that gave rise to those laws, but also what is it like now today in Russia? Where are we 3 years on?
So it's odd that the ban on so-called homosexual propaganda is actually the best known thing that's happened in Russia, and I guess it makes sense. But I don't think of it. I don't think of the chronology as starting in 2013. What happened was that in 2012, when Putin came back to the post of president, and was faced with mass protests, he decided to basically queerbait the protesters. And so the massive anti-gay campaign on television and in parliament and sort of in what passes for public space in Russia, that began in 2012. And the so-called ban on homosexual propaganda was just one of the sort of the punctuation marks in that campaign. But that campaign has continued unabated now for over 4 years. And what it's led to is just, it's not just a rise in anti-gay violence, right? And it's not even incitement to violence. It's actually a fairly concerted outsourcing of violence to vigilante groups, to paramilitary groups, and to individual actors who want to scapegoat queer people because queer people have been placed outside the law. So the prosecutions under the gay propaganda law haven't been significant. That was never the point. The point was to signal that these are people who are outside the law. And so what that's resulted in is an extreme rise in anti-gay violence and anti-LGBT violence. And that's street violence, it's attacks on queer gathering spaces. Pretty much all the public spaces that were available to queers in Russian cities 4.5 years ago are gone. Some spaces have shown up in their stead, but all those places have been shut down. And if it's There have been attacks, armed attacks, attacks with tear gas, attacks on patrons who leave a space. There has been arson. There has been all sorts of stuff. Some of this is sort of concerted for the cameras violence. There are also vigilante groups operating in a number of Russian cities that entrap, especially gay men, and then humiliate them and beat them up on camera and post this on social networks. I can go on and on. There's a huge variety of violence. Actually, I want to mention one other kind of violence that I think is very important, because public space has basically been shut off for queer people. A lot of men especially will now meet people online and invite them to their houses instead of meeting in a public space, because it is so dangerous to meet in a public space. So there's a whole new art of reading Russian obituaries, which, when I realized what I was doing with those Russian obituaries, I realized it was very much like learning to read obituaries in the United States in the 1980s, when you would read that a young man had died of something like respiratory failure, and it would say that a longtime companion survived, and you would know it was AIDS. And so when you see an obituary of a man in Russia who was found stabbed to death or beaten to death in his apartment, and there was no sign of forced entry, you know it's a gay murder. And it's common enough that you can actually sort of read between the lines of an obituary. And so what that's led to is that some people who can afford to and who can organize this for themselves have fled the country. There's a steady outflow of people. There are a lot of asylum seekers in the States and in other countries. And other people, are just becoming victims of violence.
I mean, truly horrific. And what I think has happened is that those laws have unfortunately gained popularity in the region, haven't they? We've seen some other countries adopt them as well. A similar style
Again,
of law.
the laws aren't the point.
Yeah.
The laws are a sort of small part of the cacophony of signals. It happens to be the signal that would pick up most easily in the West. But yeah, Russia in its larger sort of cultural and legal and political export, it has been exporting these anti-gay laws as a package deal with other laws that crack down on civil society. So countries like Kyrgyzstan have passed those laws in a package with laws on foreign agents and other horrible laws that are an attack on the public sphere.
Thanks. And Dennis, you talk a bit about the international response to the Russian laws in your book. Do you want to reflect a bit on the international community's response?
Can we go back to the point Masha made about queers becoming the targets of very nasty scapegoating? I think whenever I talk about the global situation, I usually start off by saying rape, murder, torture, because that is what is happening to a lot of people in many parts of the world who are or are perceived to be homosexual, queer, trans, gender or sexually diverse, whatever terms we're going to agree on or not agree on. I think that we are not sufficiently aware of the extent to which we have become an appropriate target in a whole range of countries. So we get in Australia the occasional report. If it's ISIS throwing men off buildings, that gets reported because, of course, that fits into a broader political agenda, not one I necessarily disagree with, but it is a very convenient further proof of the barbarity of ISIS. But the day-to-day life for queer people in many parts of the world is very sadly not that different to the one that Masha's describing. And when we were sitting before we came on stage, I was telling Anna about a story that came out recently of someone in Papua New Guinea who was murdered by his family because they thought his being gay brought such shame on the family. If we go to Indonesia, which is after all by far the most significant country in our part of the world, there has been a concerted homophobic set of responses from very senior people in government and of course in religious authorities over the last couple of years, which I don't think is influenced particularly by by Russia. But in a sense, what Masha's pointing to is a new alliance of some very unpleasant authoritarian governments across the world who find it convenient to appeal to concepts of the traditional family, traditional culture, traditional religion, morality, etc., to beat queers around the head. And when I say beat them around the head, I mean that unfortunately quite literally.
And when in your book, Dennis, you talk about that international response, there's some analysis around some of the more unhelpful responses from Western governments. Do you want to talk a bit about those responses and contrast them with the responses that would be more helpful?
I'm actually going to open this. We're going to get onto Trump in a minute, I can see it. Look, there's a history over the last 20 years, or maybe a bit longer now, of the international system starting to talk about sexual orientation and gender identity, which is the more appropriate term. And it's a story that actually begins in Australia, because it begins, and Anna, I want to say, Anna does extraordinary work for us at the Human Rights Law Centre, and Anna is actually the person who could be telling this story. But back in 1994, I think, Nick Toonan, young man in Tasmania, successfully brought a case to the then Human Rights Commission, which led to the federal government, which some of you will remember was the Hawke Labor government, being able to override Tasmanian anti-sodomy laws. And this was actually a really important milestone, and then not much happens. It happens at some regional levels, particularly in Europe and to some extent Latin America, but in this century there have been a whole string of movements to bring SOGI rights under the protection of international human rights law, some of which Anna herself has been involved in, representing us in discussions at Geneva. So as I say, you're really I should really be interrogating you. But the reason I can now I'm going to bring Masha in and break the rule of we're not going to get on to Trump. Well, we may have spoken
Just
for 10
do
minutes.
it.
Yeah,
we can get on to
12 minutes
Trump.
it's been.
Okay. She can see the clock and I can't. One of the things that was really fascinating over the last couple of years was the way in which Obama and Putin, in a sense, were squaring off around queer rights. The Obama administration started to make, in the language of then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, she made the statement that gay rights are human rights. And this became an important area of contestation between Obama and Putin. Now, whatever the Trump administration does, I'm prepared to bet that when the Donald is sitting in either his villa or Putin's villa, I mean, they have many villas to choose from, swapping hints about how to make the world a better place, I don't think queer rights is going to be high on the agenda. And I think the US is actually going to retreat from, and I can see you're nodding your head, so I guess you'd agree with that.
Oh yeah, it's not just going to happen. First of all, I think that the US is going to retreat from most of its international obligations. And this hasn't even been an obligation. This has been sort of a volunteer task. But the US has been a huge force, for example, in the UN in promoting LGBT rights in the face of the so-called traditional values coalition that's led by Russia. So that's not going to be happening anymore, probably in a month or 2 months. But I think domestically we're also going to see a huge shift.
And what do you think that will look like? I mean, I hear different things about Trump. We've got twinks for Trump and some elements of positivity there within our own community.
I mean, first of all, at this point, we don't know a whole lot about how he's going to govern, except that it's going to be horrible. But it does seem that he doesn't actually have a lot of interest in this sort of the day-to-day business of governing, and he's farmed out a lot of the appointments to Mike Pence, his vice president, who is probably the most homophobic elected official in the United States at the moment. He's the former governor of Indiana. This is a state where the governor personally attempted to find ways to prevent the Supreme Court's marriage ruling from taking effect, a state that has passed a so-called religious freedom law to, I wouldn't even say allow, to encourage businesses to discriminate, against LGBT people. And what we're seeing is that Trump's pick for the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, is an outspoken homophobe. His pick for education secretary is actually a so-called philanthropist who has funded gay conversion programs. And I can go on. This is...
Are there any positive signs?
No.
Okay. Just checking.
But can I just, I'm going to add, I'm going to make it more.
But actually, I want to make one quick point, which is that, there in the push for marriage rights, which has basically dominated a little bit more than a decade of the LGBT movement in the United States, there's been this idea that marriage is the path to full citizenship. It's the shortcut, and in some ways, it has functioned in that way because it has brought so much change in sort of the day-to-day lives of LGBT people in the States. But that's not the actual change in the law that's done it. It's the huge cultural shift that has accompanied the change in marriage laws. It's very unlikely that we will lose marriage just because it would require a Supreme Court ruling, and that would require at least one. There's a vacancy in the Supreme Court right now, but it wouldn't change the balance on marriage rights. So there would have to be another vacancy. It would take years. But the cultural shift can be reversed very quickly in sort of intangible ways without actually taking away the right to marry. In most of the states in the United States, there are no anti-discrimination protections for LGBT people in employment, in housing, and in public accommodation. So you can be married and not be allowed to, enter a restaurant with your spouse or rent an apartment. And I think we're going to start seeing that.
And just to go back to Trump a little bit, so are these people around him as transphobic as they are homophobic? Is there any distinction?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Okay,
yeah.
Just wanted to check.
Well, I was going to make the point that we have to remember the Republicans now control both houses of Congress. And Trump,
most of the state houses.
And the great majority of state houses. And in fact, Trump isn't, I think Masha and I are in agreement. I don't think Trump is actually going to do anything, either for or against queer rights. He doesn't need to. But the point is that when a Republican Congress sends up hostile legislation, he's not going to veto it in the way Obama might have vetoed it. I think you're more optimistic than I am about the Supreme Court, in the sense that, there are several of the people we would regard as decent judges on the Supreme Court may well die in the next couple of years, or may be forced for health reasons to retire. Again, having control of the Senate means that Trump can nominate extremely nasty right-wingers to the court and get approval. And I think most of us are aware that Barack Obama was prevented over this year from filling the current vacancy on the Supreme Court because the Republicans said, we don't care who you nominate. We're just not going to discuss it. So in that sense, Anna, my pessimism doesn't have much to do with Donald Trump, because I think Donald Trump is a total narcissist, and I'm sure if it suits him, he's going to be totally pro-queer. But in action, I don't think he's going to do anything to stop people who are quite determinedly homophobic.
Actually, I'm going to one-up you on the pessimism. Because I think you're right about Trump. He doesn't have any sort of deeply held beliefs about queers, but what he does have is a deep need to be popular.
Yes.
And there's an issue with that because he's lost the popular vote. He is not as popular as he wants to be as president of the United States. And so there's this paradoxical situation where he's coming in with unprecedented power. No American president in living memory has taken office and had this much power handed to him when he took office, right? With the vacancy of the Supreme Court, 85 federal judge vacancies, Republican Congress, Republican Senate, most of the state houses in Republican hands, and 15 years of concentration of power in the executive branch that precedes his coming into office. So he's already coming in as sort of the autocrat, and yet he doesn't have the popularity that he wants to have. And the way to have popularity is to mobilize the population against some enemy. And because he ran on a platform of an imaginary past, the return to an imaginary past, the primary candidate for reversal is the latest cultural change that has happened in the United States. And so the easiest sort of political shorthand that's available to him to say, do you want to return to an imaginary time when you felt better, is to attack queer rights. And that possibility is just going to present itself. It's going to fall into his lap. It's exactly what Putin did, for weirdly some of the same reasons, right? Because it was a shorthand way of saying, do you want to feel as comfortable as you did before the Soviet Union collapsed? Well, the one thing that we can point to that really changed after the Soviet Union collapsed is that there were gay people in Russia, which never existed before the Soviet Union collapsed, which is actually true. But I think Trump is very likely, sort of stylistically, to do the exact same thing.
Yes, because the difference is that for Putin, part of the rhetoric is an anti-Western rhetoric. And that's been played out very clearly in places like the Ukraine. That isn't available in the US. I mean, you can't attack queer rights as a Western import when you are the centre of Western
But you can attack it as a liberal, something that liberals have forced down your throat.
I guess on that scale, I'm slightly more optimistic than you are, but I think my pessimism is about the capture by the Republican Party of most of the institutions of government and the capture by the right of the Republican Party. And one of the things we forget in Australia, because we don't do it this way, is that state legislatures draw the districts for the House of Representatives. And the Republicans are very, very good at this. So they, in effect, can gerrymander themselves into a permanent majority. And this really scares me. So even though there will be midterm elections for Congress in 2 years' time, it is quite possible this will further cement right-wing Republican control.
It's been, so looking for sources of optimism, it's been suggested to me that because Trump's wife acted in a lesbian porn film, supposedly, I was told,
You're really grasping at straws
that should give us.
Anna.
But how about the fact that he's, for me, as a simple advocate layperson, he seems to come from a place of celebrity culture, and that's where he draws some of his popularity from. And the culture in television and Hollywood is not a conservative one, I don't think.
It's an interesting argument, but first of all, in terms of the wife, the wife also is an immigrant to the United States.
True.
Who entered under circumstances of questionable legality, and that doesn't seem to have turned Trump into someone who's at all friendly toward immigrants. So I think we can sort of write the imaginary wife influence off. I think the celebrity culture argument is more interesting. I don't see it exerting enough pressure on him, especially now looking. I was deeply pessimistic about this even before he started making his cabinet appointments. But looking at his cabinet appointments, it just seems that this is not something that is at all dear to his heart. And this is not a man also who has friendships. He's not a man who has strong relationships. He's not a man who honors commitments. Sort of imagining that he has a group of friends from Hollywood or from the New York fashion world who would say to him, Donald, don't do this. I just can't see that happening.
Anna, when you made that comment about his wife as a putative porn star, my mind flashed back to something Gore Vidal said about the 1964 election, which was that all the hustlers voted for Goldwater. And I think the serious point is we can't assume, there will be, I'm sure, some queer people around Donald Trump. I mean, there's the Silicon Valley.
Peter Thiel, yeah.
We know, one of the things we should have learned from history is that doesn't by itself prevent very nasty policies. But I'm fascinated by the idea that he might resort to queer baiting as a way of becoming more popular. It's not something he did during the campaign. He attacked pretty well everybody more viciously. But I don't think that it actually matters. I mean, I think, as I say, it's the institutional power of the right. And, to your list, you could have added the new Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, who's an extremely nasty man on pretty well any count I think you and I could imagine.
And turning now to Australia, Dennis, what do you think all of this means for us here?
The awful thing is I was in the States during the elections and I came back about a week later and I was still shell-shocked. I guess what really surprised me was the extent to which the shell shock had come across the Pacific. And I think the reality is that we are so embroiled in American power. And I don't just mean political power. I'm not just thinking of the alliance or the economic relationship. I'm thinking of the cultural hegemony that the United States has, not just here, but in so many parts of the world. I think we are going to have to work very hard to prevent the Australian right using what will come out of the new US administration to further their aims. And I think that we have to do this both in terms of our domestic policy and also in terms of how we relate to the rest of the world, and particularly to our part of the world. And I think that there are certain immediate tests. Pretty clear, I think, that Trump will start cutting back on US foreign aid. And I think it will take a bit of time because bureaucracies move slowly, but the aid that the Americans have been giving to a lot of queer groups in a number of developing countries will certainly go once the Trump machine have got control of USAID. I think there is a role here for us, and Australia is not playing a particularly important role in this area compared to, say, the Americans, the Dutch, the British, the Swedes. I think where it becomes most vital for us, and this is something where Anna and I have been, I think, on the same side for a number of years, is how we treat asylum seekers, and particularly how we treat people who, like Masha, have had to leave their countries because they are queer. And I find it very scary that in the last weekend Australian, one of Murdoch's House columnists basically said, well, it isn't really a problem for the guys on Manus if they can't be resettled because they can just resettle in Papua New Guinea. Now, the reality is, if you're a homosexual man, you face not just legal impediments, that is, you are criminalised if you have sex with another man in PNG, but more important, this goes really back to how you were talking about the situation in Russia. You face victimisation that could lead certainly to assault, possibly to murder. And we have the apologists for this government saying, well, that's okay, we're going to send some women and children who the US approves of to safe refuge there. Yeah, we know there are a few hundred men on Manus, tough shit. And I think that, therefore, the whole issue of how we react to people seeking asylum because of their sexuality is the greatest single test of whether we can remain a decent country or whether we can become a decent country in face of a right who are going to use the Trump script, as we already see them doing. We're in furious agreement, I think.
But I'm also seeing actually a lot of panic among asylum seekers in the States. Yeah. We don't know how many people, but there are thousands of people who are currently awaiting asylum in the US. Lawyers who work in that area think that there's no immediate danger of their not getting asylum. The track record in the States has actually been very, very good. It's upwards of 90% of people getting asylum on LGBT grounds, but it varies hugely from region to region. And the one group of asylum seekers that's most vulnerable are people who are in detention facilities. And we don't know how many people there are because the Obama administration has never said how many people are actually being held in immigration detention facilities. but the conditions in those facilities are absolute hell. There are definitely tens of thousands of people in these facilities, and if they're hell for everybody, they are, the ninth circle of hell for LGBT people. And that's going to get worse because we're likely to be seeing more people rounded up into these detention facilities, because even though Trump has talked about mass deportations, and even though immediately after the election he sort of calmed some fears by saying he was only going to be deporting people with criminal records, that certainly did not calm any fears among immigrants or their lawyers, because what becomes a crime in the eyes of immigration authorities and crimes that are grounds for deportation. Like one of the cases that just broke my heart was the case of this 19-year-old kid who jumped the turnstile in the New York City subway twice. And because jumping the turnstile is a crime of deception, it becomes a crime of moral turpitude, which is grounds for deportation in the United States. So this 19-year-old became subject to deportation. One of the things that we're going to see in the States is that there's the majority of immigrants who live in the States live in the larger cities that consider themselves to be sanctuary cities. So New York is a sanctuary city, Los Angeles is a sanctuary city. And the question will become, and I think this question will arise very, very soon, are they going to allow their police to be used to round up immigrants who are subject to deportation within those cities? Now, the mayor of New York has already said that he would not, which I think is wonderful. The mayor of LA, as far as I know, has not actually spoken out on the subject. But that's sort of the hedge that immigrants have against mass deportations, which could be in the very, very near future.
Okay. And if I should put in a plug for an event later this week at the Wheeler Centre on Thursday, there's a discussion about LGBT refugees. If people are interested in that topic, I encourage you to get along. Coming back to the region, Dennis, I mean, the shocking situation in PNG is unfortunately, obviously, not isolated. And when we think about Australia's role in the region, we do play a leadership role, in particular in the Pacific. But you know what I think about this. But do you think we should be doing more to promote LGBTI rights in our region? And what does that look like?
And I think Anna and I probably talked about this a number of times, I get very nervous about us saying we play a leadership role, because from the point of view of people in small Pacific Island states, that actually sounds like we're the bullies. And I don't think that I think that our taking a leadership role has a huge number of problems attached to it. That isn't to say I think there's nothing we can do. I think there are many things that the Australian government can do, but most of them should probably be done quietly and without rhetoric, and certainly without doing things that the US has engaged in at various points, like flying rainbow flags outside embassies in countries where that just is a provocation. But we can provide much more quiet on-the-ground support where there are groups. We can certainly do a lot in terms of how we flag our acceptance of refugees who are seeking asylum on the grounds of their sexuality. I think the area where we really can be doing much more than we are is in the very large number of development NGOs who are running programs, not only in the Pacific, but in many parts. There are Australian NGOs play a significant role in a lot of countries in Africa, across South Asia, in the Middle East, and of course in the Pacific. And I think that the most important task is to actually, because they're often in contact with grassroots community organisations, they are in a position to bring queer issues into larger coalitions, into discussions, in ways that governments probably can't. So I think that governments can provide money, governments can make the right sounds at international fora, but often I think there is the danger of us trying to lead actually boomeranging. It provides exactly the rhetoric that leaders who want to talk about Asian values. I'm thinking now what's happened, the whole tradition of promoting Asian values that has come out of Southeast Asia in the last 2 decades, that's playing into their hands, and it's a really tricky one.
I disagree, actually.
I knew you would.
Oh, good. Because I think that, I mean, I have trouble with that argument of, oh, they're going to use that rhetoric against us. Well, they will use that rhetoric against us anyway. And certainly, you know, I can talk to Russia, and Russia will never tire of talking about the West forcing its liberal values down Russia's unsuspecting throat, regardless of how much any Western country bends over backwards to accommodate sort of Russia's newfound love of so-called traditional values. And when I think about a rainbow flag being flown by a U.S. embassy, I really couldn't care less about all the local officials who are going to see that rainbow flag and feel provoked. I care about the local queers who will see that rainbow flag and feel affirmed and feel like there's somebody who is actually willing to fly a flag for them.
Yes, but the problem is, this sounds great, but and it may well be.
It actually feels pretty good too.
And it feels good. It feels good for you in Russia. But you know, I'm reflecting what last weekend at the Homosexual Histories Conference, 2 people, one Indonesian, one Australian who spent a lot of time in Indonesia, were talking about the fear that local queers have when there is too much apparent linking of their movement with Western support. And I think one has to balance this very carefully. Of course, I agree with Masha entirely that one doesn't accommodate. So nothing I'm saying is to suggest that we should in any way accept the sort of rhetoric and the sort of activities and the sort of policies that we see in countries like Russia. But I think that our intervention has to be very careful. And I think the reality is, as a rich, predominantly European country, going out into the Pacific or into Southeast Asia and saying we want to lead is not particularly helpful. I think our relations to Russia are somewhat different. And I think there are ways in which we can do much more than we are. All I'm saying is we have to think of the consequences, and we have to test those consequences with local groups and with local communities. And there I think we're in total agreement.
Yeah, I think
there are examples like support from, and this is something where I know the Australian government did give support, the St. Petersburg Queer Film Festival. And I think while we didn't fly a rainbow flag, it's very interesting that one of the last things Bob Carr did when he was foreign minister was to meet with a queer group. You may have been there in St. Petersburg. Yeah. Interesting is right at the end of his excessively long but entertaining memoirs. And I thought, this is really great. And I think, you know, what Masha's saying is important, because sometimes what we can do is provide safe spaces. But I'm all for us making clear we provide safe spaces for people here, not just over there.
And I think the Australian government, from my dealings with them, are very sensitive to that, and that common thread of making sure what you do on the ground doesn't, in fact, lead to reprisals. I mean, it goes without saying, but in fact helps people on the ground and provides that safe space. And whether that means going in and providing a health service that looks like a health service but it's actually a social space for queer people in that community, those sorts of activities and sensitivities, I think that's what we're talking about here.
I agree, but I don't know, we've progressed a long way. When the AIDS epidemic began, back in the late 80s, the Australian government was actually quietly, through local embassies, providing support to the Library Foundation in Manila, to Pink Triangle in Kuala Lumpur, in ways that I'm not sure we're still doing. And I think that, and this is where I think Masha and I would be in agreement, because I think that it is important that queer rights are up front in our official statements of what our values are in foreign policy. And I've yet to see the current foreign minister. I'm told she's sympathetic. But being told she's sympathetic, you know, I can't reach her on my mobile. I don't know this is true. I want her to make clear that rape, murder and torture of people on the basis of their sexuality or their gender identity is not something Australia accepts or tolerates.
That's quite a radical statement you want made there.
Well, you know, when I'm with you, no, I mean, I believe that quite strongly. But as I say, I was just a little uncomfortable with the leadership. Sorry.
We'll set that as a KPI for Julie Bishop for the next year.
Thank you.
A supportive public statement on LGBTI rights being a foreign policy priority.
Yeah, I mean, we vote the right way in various UN...
We're very good.
And I know Australia is now actually playing quite an active role in New York in supporting this. And I want to say a lot of credit goes to people like Anna and the Human Rights Law Centre for this happening. But I think it's also important that it's acknowledged, but it's important it's acknowledged locally. It's important that Australians know that our government believes in these things. So, you know, my concern is, I think, really just stemmed from the word leadership, because I think that for us to claim we lead in the Pacific has been a recipe for very strong and understandable reactions. On the whole, it's not a good idea to claim you're a leader in a country where you were once the coloniser.
That's a good point. I mean, in terms of the Pacific, I think, and the global movement, the Pacific has a unique role to play in debunking some of those myths that are peddled around LGBT rights being a form of Western imperialism, because there's these unique ways in which sexual and gender identities are expressed in Pacific Islander cultures that are very rooted in history, rooted in their own cultures. And if we can support the Pacific to play more of a role at the UN, to be telling the stories of local Whawhawhine or Leyte people, of people with mixed genders and who've been accepted by their communities, I think that's something that's really powerful. So if Australia can help do that, then I think that's a real sign of progress.
Well, I'm not going to disagree with that. I'll just point out that, of course, the same is true for countries across Southeast Asia. And one of the scary things, I mean, the recent vote in the UN General Assembly...
Do you want to talk people through that a bit, Dennis?
I hoped you would.
Okay.
Maybe I'll let Anna talk you through, but then I'll make the comment I wanted to make about it. So talk us through the recent UN General Assembly vote.
So in June this year, we had, by way of a special a resolution of the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, the establishment of the first ever UN independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity. This is a truly historic occasion because, as we've already covered, LGBTI rights or SOGI rights are controversial and contested internationally. So we got the votes, we established this new special expert to play a role in identifying gaps in legal protections and examples of good practice and shining a light on these issues across the world. Now, in an unprecedented move in the General Assembly recently, there's a committee that usually just approves these appointments, and there was a push by the unfriendly forces of, including states like Russia, to actually try and insert some qualifying text into the or basically try and stop this appointment going through. I won't go into the detail. And there was a lot of mobilisation of international LGBTI activists around the world. Countries like Australia and the US were working actively to garner enough support to block this hostile action. And we managed to win, but the vote was very close, wasn't it, Dennis?
Well, the comment I was going to make is that the expert's already been appointed. And the expert is Vichit Muntaporn from Thailand. And people who've been interested in international human rights law will know that he's one of the framers of the Yogyakarta Declaration, which is an attempt to include SOGI in international human rights discourses. Even though he is Thai, the only Southeast Asian country other than Thailand that supported the appointment going ahead was, interestingly, Vietnam. But I think we should be really concerned. You were not surprised that Malaysia, Indonesia and Brunei voted against, because they are part of the refusnik bloc. I am surprised and disappointed that the Philippines and Burma both abstained. So I think that, and we're now talking at a state level, and it's hard to know how important this is. But I think that in this case, to have blocked that appointment would have been really important. And I think it really goes back to Masha's point that Putin has been very able to build alliances with the African group and I've forgotten what the Islamic group is now called, whatever the group that links all the Islamic countries together. They're a very powerful bloc. And I suspect that if that vote were to happen in a year's time, with the US probably just staying out of it. I don't think they'd vote against it. I don't think they'd use political capital.
Well, yeah, I mean, the biggest thing, there were 50 US diplomats working actively behind the scenes to make sure that vote didn't.
It's incredible.
And that's just not going to happen. Yeah. If that issue comes up again, we're not going to have that commitment.
Yeah. And this is actually where Australia could perhaps play more of a leadership role and where we could make some really interesting alliances, because I think the most interesting pressure at the global level, at the international level around this, is coming from some Latin American countries. And, you know, there's a really nice argument for us to start thinking across the South. We're not southern in the usual language of development, but we are geographically southern. Maybe the one good thing we as Australians can take out of the Trump victory is that it certainly makes questioning our blind allegiance to a picture of the world that is dictated from Washington and London. I mean, no, London's a minor player, but not in our eyes. Maybe the Trump victory will seriously lead us to reconsider that and to think in quite new ways about potential allies. And on queer issues, there are potential allies for us in South Africa, in Argentina, in Uruguay, in countries we haven't traditionally thought of as major diplomatic partners. And this is where certainly leadership is relevant.
Do you agree, Masha?
I agree, Anna.
And for those that don't know, Australia's also, well, Julie's very occupied at the moment because we've got a bid for candidacy to be a member of the UN Human Rights Council. So Australia at the moment has an incentive, or indeed has a strong driver, to be seen to be doing the right thing internationally on human rights issues. And generally it does. But what we see is, as Dennis identified, is that we do take a very proactive position on LGBTI rights internationally, but it's almost like this shyness around promoting it back home because of the elements within the coalition that aren't as supportive on these issues. I think when Australia supported a progressive motion, let's call it a motion, on the family and inclusion of LGBTI people in the family, there was a lot of heat on the foreign minister from the religious right, and those sorts of dynamics play out. We saw Tony Abbott go over to the US and speak at a conference of a major player in the anti-LGBT global movement that does a lot of advocacy in UN circles as well. So the coalition is not obviously of one mind on these issues domestically, and that affects how we communicate about our international work. So talking a bit more about, I guess, the Western and language that's used in queer rights. Dennis, you talk a bit in your book about the shifts in language and the impact that language can have on the way rights is progressed. Do you think we've come to a point where language is holding us back?
I think there's a really interesting set of questions to be asked, and Masha will presumably reflect on this very much out of your experiences in Russia and the former Soviet bloc across Eastern Europe and Eurasia. There's an interesting question to be asked about how people in other parts of the world hear us when we talk about human rights. Because for us, human rights has become an unquestionable good. You know, if you say something is a human right, we think that's in a way that's settled the argument. But that is not necessarily the case in most parts of the world. And I think it's a complicated issue, because I would agree with you that there are certain things we cannot compromise on. And I think Masha has written very, very recently, when you've been writing about the US elections, your line has been, and I'd agree with this, there are certain basic things where compromise doesn't help. it can only lead to defeat. But I think at the same time, being sensitive to how concepts we use are understood for people who come out of different traditions is really important. And as I say, I'd be interested to know whether you think the human rights language is necessarily the best language in which to talk about queer issues in, say, the former Soviet republics of Central Asia.
Central Asia was a curveball.
Sorry.
No, I can't speak to Central Asia, but I think that I mean Russia in particular has done a great deal to discredit the language of human rights in the last few years, and in fact, one of the sort of catchphrases of the current Russian ideology is that there are two civilizations in the world. There's the Western civilization with its idea of universal human rights. But in fact, there's nothing universal about human rights. And there's the other civilization, which is the traditional values civilization, of which Russia is the spiritual center. And that's the civilization that rejects human rights. I don't think you can deal with that by adjusting the language of human rights. I think the only way to deal with it is actually to double down on the language of human rights. I mean, that's sort of the heart of the confrontation. Yeah. It's not a question of interpretation.
Yeah. When the debate that Anna talked about in the UN was interesting because the African bloc who'd made the attempt to remove the position of an independent expert, their line is actually, we of course believe in human rights, but human rights do not include sexual orientation and gender identity, and they quite specifically said this is infringing national sovereignty. Yeah. And that is now whether we like it or not, I don't like it, but it's a very powerful argument in countries that were colonised. It's a very powerful argument for the Chinese. I would agree with Masha. I don't want to compromise with it, but at the same time, that is the language people are using. And that language reflects, I think, an ability to mobilise national sentiment, which really takes us back to the secret of Putin's queer bashing. I mean, I assume Putin personally is not particularly homophobic. This is a convenient way of building national support.
Well, I mean, that's true of any campaign against any minority anywhere at any time. But I don't, when you talk about whether it's a good idea to compromise, I don't even understand what you're talking about, to be honest. Because what's the alternative? How do you respond to that kind of effort to discredit the language?
I think that if you are a Westerner from Australia, speaking to people in China, you would find other ways that would relate to, and I don't know Chinese, but I think there are other terms one would use that would stress some sense of universality that doesn't necessarily sound as if it is the language of Western neoliberalism.
Well, the people who are framing it as Western neoliberalism are doing so specifically to discredit it, right?
Yes.
And I think that you immediately find yourself sort of going down the path of saying, well, yes, it's good that you believe in human rights. We have common ground there. Now let's talk about LGBT rights, and that that's not a place where I think it's acceptable to find yourself.
Except that I think that if you're talking to the people who say we believe in human rights, but they would say we believe equally in human rights when they involve economic and social rights. So the right to health, the right to housing, the right to clean water, for us, are rights. And that is not the emphasis that tends to be heard when Westerners talk about human rights. So I think it's really a matter of, I mean, to me, one needs to talk about rights, respect, dignity in ways that understand the reality, and the reality for most queer people is that issues of immediate survival are crucial. And we need to find...
That's a human right too.
Exactly. But that's, I think, the point, that the language that is used by us, meaning people in the West, and by people who run queer movements in the West, by and large, when they talk about human rights, it is a particular set of liberal political values. What I think we have to include and make equally important is that concept of human rights that involves the second generation. I can't remember
economic, social and cultural.
Yes. Yeah. And that's where I think we have fallen down. So in a way, I agree with you. Yes, we talk about rights, but we understand that for many people in the world, they can dismiss rights because they don't realise that it encompasses a whole range of issues. And there I think we would be in agreement.
Yeah. And what we see globally, and this is what the activists try and do, is that you go to the survival, you go to finding agreement around non-discrimination and violence. You don't start with issues of marriage equality, obviously. But turning now to marriage equality, because it's topical in Australia, Masha, what do you think the US experience on marriage equality teaches us? I'm not sure how much you know about the debate in Australia, but you reflected earlier on some of the culture wars really that have arisen post-marriage equality and these regressive efforts to basically promote discrimination on the basis of religious freedom. We're at a point in Australia where it feels like we're closer to marriage equality than ever before, but in some ways we've gotten rid of our plebiscite idea, and we really need to try and harness our energy and get this done in the next term in the face of a bit of, I think, political fatigue. How does Australia go about achieving marriage equality that avoids some of those culture wars that are happening in the US right now?
Oh, I don't think you can ever avoid a backlash. So I don't think there are any words of wisdom there. It seems to me, I really don't actually know enough about the Australian situation, but it seems to me they're pretty different starting points.
Very different.
Because in the US, it really was a way to sort of torpedo a lot of rights and a lot, again, of cultural change that has, I think, already occurred in Australia, right? So, yeah. They're very different battles. I mean, I think, again, in the US, it was fantastically effective. Not so much because of the right to marriage, but because of the cultural change that it brought. And I think that if it weren't for the Trump presidency, it would probably, in the long run, prove a lot more effective. I think what we're about to see is a really bloody backlash. And just to give you one example, these religious freedom laws, which I think a lot of state houses are now going to champion, and the federal government is certainly going to champion, will create exemptions for private institutions allowing discrimination. So among those institutions that can with high likelihood identify as religious are hospitals. So one of the flagship rights that marriage equality brought, which was hospital visitation, is going to be legally taken away without reversing marriage equality. And I think that's going to be much harder to fight because it was gained through marriage. It was not actually gained through some other channel that would have focused on how important that particular right was and how right it was to have that right.
And through a court process and litigation rather than a popular parliamentary process.
Although there's, at the moment, there's huge popular support for marriage equality in sort of all those permutations. But I think it's probably more fragile than we realize.
Dennis, I can feel you wanting to talk.
Well, I always get into trouble when I talk about marriage equality, but there is a deja vu, because you remember, Masha, we sat on the stage of the Sydney Town Hall 3 years ago and talked about marriage, and we both, I think, got into terrible trouble with people.
Yeah, well,
they're the best kinds of talks.
That actually, that made me a star of the Breitbart news site.
Right.
Which was a marginal website until a couple of months ago. But
the point I was going to make is I think I can see a situation where if the current government are really clever, they will actually give us marriage equality, but with a whole set of apparent protections of religious freedom, which will actually be the sorts of things Masha's talking about. And so I would just say, as I say, I know I will get into trouble. I would say to the marriage equality movement, be careful if you get what you want, because you may find out it's not what you wanted at all.
No, I think that's a really good point, Dennis. What I think the battleground will be in the next chapter of this debate, and perhaps it's not going to be a battle that's a big, loud public one, is the text of the marriage equality legislation that is hopefully eventually passed. And we've already seen the Attorney General, George Brown, just release a bill that has unprecedented carve-outs for religious organisations and ministers of religion, even if their church has a pro-marriage equality position that allows an individual minister to discriminate and for an individual civil celebrant to discriminate as well. So those really expansive exemptions, I think, are an attempt to deal with the sorts of concerns that are coming up in the US. But the question is, how far do you go before they undermine the purpose of the law itself?
And before they actually enshrine discrimination in law.
Yeah. And they're very much being included as a response to the litigation in the States. I mean, when we talk to politicians in Australia, that's what they point to. And one of the issues is that a lot of the litigation in the States has been brought on constitutional grounds, and as people probably know, we don't have a Bill of Rights in Australia, which is a very sad thing. We don't have constitutionally enshrined rights protection, so the actual prospect of litigation is quite low, but it's this fear the Conservatives have of the slippery slope and, us naughty gays asserting our rights around our relationships. Now we've got 14 minutes left for some questions from the audience. Is anyone bursting to ask a question?
Hi. I was wondering whether, on a international level, whether the US election has actually clouded our observation of the destructive nature of Vladimir Putin's machine in trying to build up support for anti-GLBT rights. Does that make sense?
And anti what?
GLBT rights on an international level. Does that make sense or not really?
No.
Well, it was only last week that they announced that Putin is starting to amalgamate both foreign intelligence agency with state intelligence agency to create one agency, which possibly could be a return to his KGB sort of roots. Do you think, the puppet of Trump has maybe fallen into Putin's sort of hand?
Not at all, no. I think that Trump is... this has been a conversation in the States for the last 4 or 5 months, and it's a very tempting idea to think of the all-powerful evil Putin and his puppet Donald Trump. It's actually much more frightening to think about Trump as the American creation that he is. I think that Putin's role in the US election was the same role that Russia has played in Western European elections for the last several years, which is to disrupt and to cause havoc. Putin doesn't want or need Trump in power in the US. It actually really disrupts the picture of the world that he has created and on which he has rested a lot of his power. He needs the US as an enemy, as a liberal proselytizing enemy. If the US suddenly stops playing that role, if the US has an anti-globalization president, then who needs a Russian anti-globalization president? So that's, it was not his goal to put Donald Trump in power in the US. And Americans did that.
Next question.
Thank you. I lived in the States a lot and I vote there as well, legally. I'm dual citizenship, and I lived right through both Clinton terms and the first Bush term. And I came running back to Australia thinking I'd be safe here and ran into the arms of John Howard and Children Overboard. But Dennis, I think we should go back to what you were saying about Pence as the Vice President, because we saw once before when George W. Bush was supposedly there in charge. He wasn't in charge at all. He was too dumb to be in charge, and he was being manipulated and operated as a marionette by sinister forces behind him. And yet, Americans elected the most extraordinary outcome to get an African American as president. That was as a stunning an outcome. So if Trump tripped over and was impeached or something like that, God willing, goddess willing, Pence would become the president. And the power behind the throne would show its steely teeth. How can we find the roots of a new movement that would do something as extraordinary as getting Obama in, when it looked so bleak in the States?
Well, I don't think... I'm not going to try and answer that because, to be honest, we're not here to talk about the trajectory of American politics. I have lots of views on it. Masha has lots of views on it, and she's going to be spending a whole evening talking about it in Bendigo, I think, next week?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I really encourage you to go to that, where I think there will be a discussion of those possibilities.
Next question.
Hi. My question is about Europe. Particularly Western Europe. Just wondering, I'd like to hear your thoughts on what you think the new constellation is going to mean for pan-European dynamics in terms of LGBT rights. Traditionally, proving oneself, for a state to prove oneself as making some progress on LGBT rights has been part of the list of things that one has to do to try and get into the EU, for example, but with a new kind of constellation in terms of Putin and Trump, what do you think this is going to do to the European context?
That's for you,
Masha.
You think?
We heard last week that if a French election was held tomorrow, Le Pen might win, for example. There are plenty of things going on in Western Europe that are quite frightening as well.
I think at this point there's somewhat on parallel tracks. The requirements for entry to the EU are not terribly likely to change in the very near future, just because it's a bureaucratic system and it takes a long time to change, and there's not yet a critical mass in Europe to create the pressure for that to change. At the same time, thinking about European elections, we're not just talking about France, we're talking about Austria next week, most likely electing a far-right president. The German election, I'm feeling much more pessimistic about it than I think most people I know. The Swedes in 2018 are going to probably elect the far right, and you can just go down the list. So I think it's I think what we're witnessing is actually the collapse of the European Union, and so the question of how Eastern European countries are going to be gaining entry to it will probably become irrelevant much sooner than we'd like.
On that somber note, next question.
Hi there. I'd like to ask a couple questions. One is to pick up on mentioning of Vietnam. I know that other post-socialist countries that have a complicated relationship with the U.S. because of war politics, human rights have always been tied very tightly with bilateral trade support, like the WTO and debt, loans from the World Bank and so on. So Vietnam had to often prove its worthiness to, receive so-called development support from the world community through improving their so-called human rights. So I wondered for the panel, what you think, how you think LGBT human rights relates to the way that Russia or other countries relate to their economic relationships to countries like the United States or other leaders in LGBT human rights. And then the second question was just about Fidel Castro's recent death and how that plays out in terms of LGBT human rights for Russia or other post-socialist countries or related, lineages, and if it does at all.
I'm sorry, I don't know what the question is. Do you?
Masha, do you want to have a crack? No?
There was two questions.
Well, perhaps we could have
yeah.
one question that we can answer, given we've got 2 minutes.
Well, the first question was about how LGBT human rights you thought relates to the ways that, let's say, the global South tries to position themselves economically. Because, for example, Vietnam, in order to receive aid from the World Bank or other kind of economic, organizations in the world, they had to kind of prove that their human rights were being improved. So there was always strings attached, in other words, to human rights aid. So I wondered, in your perspective, as LGBT human rights is improving around the world, and developing in all of the things that you mentioned in this panel, how you see that playing out, so in other words, human rights is not just like in a vacuum, it's also connected to all these economic struggles. So let's just say that's my question right now.
Well, I think there's a question there about attempts to tie trade and development to certain expectations around rights, if I understood correctly. I think that on balance, aid conditionality probably doesn't work, and it's very difficult to enforce. I think that it's important when there are discussions about trade treaties, obviously, that one raises these questions, but my sense is in the end those decisions are made without much concern for rights, and I think that there are some interesting, you did point to Vietnam, I'm sorry, but the quality of the microphone makes it sometimes difficult to hear when we're sitting up here.
It's okay, I think you've answered the question, that's useful.
Yeah, but okay.
On a positive note, I happen to know that the US ambassador to Vietnam is gay, and he's like a major celebrity in Vietnam, and they love him. So there's those sorts of soft diplomacy that is being actually quite effective at achieving cultural change as well, even if all the trade negotiations don't bring in queer rights into them in the way that we'd like them to. We should
probably stop right here. That was a positive note.
Yes.
Finally. We've got 3 minutes left, so I'll if there's a burning question, we can ask it. Otherwise, I'm going to wrap up.
Well, could I just make one comment, Anna, that the US ambassador to Australia was gay, and it had no effect on the current government's attitude to either marriage or safe schools. So I think that the reality is, yes, I'm all in favour of soft diplomacy, but let's not get carried away with nice puff pieces that are written in English telling us how wonderful things are because there's a gay ambassador in Hanoi. I'm sorry,
no,
I spoke to a
Vietnamese activist who I met in the US, and we were talking about the impact that those sorts of roles had on cultural change in those societies. So it was from the horse's mouth. Okay, I'm going to take that as no more burning questions. Thank you so much to both of you. I think this has been a really enlightening discussion. I'd urge everyone to check out the books down the back. There's quite a few that Hares and Hyenas are selling there, so support two fantastic authors and a fantastic local queer bookshop. I know we talked, there's a lot to be pessimistic and indeed probably a bit frightened about that's going on in the world today, but I think we can only keep talking about it and thinking about it and having these conversations, and as we've found, there are also signs of hope as well, and we have to cling on to those. So thank you everyone for coming, and have a good evening. Safe travels. Thank you.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and the world.